annual town meeting warrant, so I stress that it's draft. I've been working on it for a long time. But in addition to the full warrant, which I think I've been giving you rough copies of, I also included all the attachments at the back as they exist right now. So if we need to look at those, we can, and I stress it's draft. So for example, I wrote down recommendations from the Select Board and Finance Committee, knowing that both groups have yet to take their votes. And then lastly, there's a one page at the end of your packet. Paul Tilton did work on a summary at the committee's request of what the first year of the this upcoming fiscal year's infrastructure projects would look like if we had the current amount that's in our budget, which is a hair over 2 million, and then the additional projects at the bottom that add up roughly to the 560,000 that we've talked about, just so you'd have a feel about the additional work that could be done for that money. Doesn't mean every single one of these is going to be exact, but it's based on what their work plan is, so it's quite accurate. Paul's joining us remotely. If we need to ask him any questions about this, we can follow up with him. And that was it.
Okay, thank you, Bud. While Paul is on and this list is fresh, are there any questions regarding the list? Bob?
Yep, thank you very much for the list. Paul, I am not an engineer or a member of the DPW, so I'm guessing a bit here. But to me, it looks like the list of proposed projects' current budget is largely maintenance activity, surface treatment, and chip seal, and that what I would characterize as more significant repair activity has all been prioritized within the additional infrastructure funding request. Is that a fair read of this list?
I think if you go by strictly just the number, there are a lot more surface treatments, the preventative maintenance, but the overall cost of that is only $250,000 for that preventative maintenance. So it's relatively low compared to the overall cost for the current budget. And one of the reasons we have, for instance, below the pavement, milling, and top course, those are associated with streets in the village. So what we looked at doing there is, rather than split those up, trying to make it even throughout the current budget and the requested budget, is if it's not approved, we don't want to split it up, do half this year and half next year. Mainly for mobilization, it's a lot easier and a lot less expensive to focus on an area. So we would focus on the downtown village area with that project. If we do get the 560 approved, they would all be done this year. And I hope that explains it.
I think that's helpful to me. I have to say, and this is to you, Paul, and to Bud, based solely on the amount of email activity and phone activity I've gotten in the last week, roads are a significant concern to taxpayers. And I've heard from a number of taxpayers that they don't believe that if their current public road were a private way and that they were actually trying to get the town to take the road, that it is the conditions of those roads are so poor that the roads do not meet the town's own standards for a taking of a private way. And I'd at least like to suggest, tonight and perhaps for a future meeting, I'd be very interested in understanding what our inventory of roads, public roads in those conditions are, and how we're thinking about addressing that backlog. I think it's significant. I understand the budget challenges, but and I understand prioritizing maintenance. I understand the logic behind it. But at some point, I think we should be having a more fulsome public discussion around the very worst of the Sandwich public roads and why they're not being addressed, and for how long we're not going to address them in the name of prioritizing maintenance elsewhere. So that's a future agenda item, please.
Okay, anything else for Paul? Nancy?
Paul, just to clarify, I think we said before that if this roughly 600,000 is approved this year, it will be continued every year after this, and so there'll be a dedicated significant amount to this part of roads that we didn't have before, right? Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. And that certainly helps us take care of all conditions of roads, not only in our preventative maintenance, but we can start to knock off some of the roads that are in really tough shape out there, which we haven't been able to do because we haven't had the funding over the years. So we fall farther and farther behind in that area. With the additional funding recently and potentially this funding, it'll help us, attack some of those roads as well as the preventative maintenance roads.
And if I remember correctly, you can handle this amount of work in-house, right?
We can, yes. When we had some road bonds in the past, we were spending over $2 million per year as part of that budget. So it shouldn't be an issue. And also, as we mentioned before, the Chapter 90 can be carried over each year, so it does not have to be expended within the fiscal year.
Thank you.
And,
Sure.
and just Nancy's question regarding the ongoing funding using the 600,000 and it becoming an ongoing operating expense. I think you used that, Bud, as an example of the pressure that then puts on the 2.5% levy.
Yeah, so we're hopeful that if it gets added to the base, it should help us, maintain that moving forward. If financial difficulties fall upon the town in 5 years and we have to look at reductions, we'd look at everything on the table. But I think our hope is by having roughly half in the operating budget and half in the capital, it's a decent mix. I'm sure, same thing Bob would say, if we had $4 million a year, we could address some of those other roads, but then we're charging people that much more to get to that number. Far and away, this is the most money we would have ever had for an annual budget for our roads. And don't forget, the committee was supportive with the select board in putting $650,000 in his budget 3 years ago, and we've been able to maintain that without any problem. So that's been positive.
Okay. Anything further for Paul before we move on? Okay. So as I mentioned last week, town bylaws require the Finance Committee to consider all fiscal articles in the warrants for all town meetings and report its recommendations before each annual town meeting. And that is our main agenda item for this evening. So I'd like to begin by opening things up with any questions, comments, discussions anyone on the committee has in regard to the operating capital budgets or any of the other articles we'll be voting on this evening. And as a note, there will also be the opportunity after each article is motioned for discussion as well. But does anyone want to open up with anything this evening? If not, we can move right into the warrants. And we will do that. So let's move through each article in the warrant, and we can discuss and vote on each one as we move through. So but do you want to lead us through it?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want me to touch on the non-financial ones just for the public's sake, but the first article is just to accept the annual town reports and hear a quick summary of the Select Board's long-range plan. Article 2 is really the big budget article where over 90% of our expenses are all found on pages. If you look at the summary that was handed out that I printed from this afternoon, on pages 6 and 7 of the warrant, it's all the backup numbers with what was appropriated in FY24, what was appropriated for this year, and what's recommended for next. All those numbers tie in with the budget binders that you've been provided and what we've gone over. And it does include the extra $560,000 in the DPW operating budget. So the grand total on everything there, when you factor in everything that's being voted, is just over $99,500,000. Of all the articles in the warrant, this is the only one that impacts taxes because all the rest of the articles come from other sources.
Okay, do I have a motion to proceed with fiscal '26 budget?
Motion. Motion?
Motion by Crystal. Any second? Nancy seconds. Any discussion on the budget? Nancy?
So I've been very vocal about the school budget and the wing school. So I contacted Ed and then contacted the superintendent. And we had a good discussion yesterday about it. He's a victim of not knowing what was agreed upon before. And I know he's got one, if not more, administrators that were around for that, but he wasn't told about any of it. We couldn't, I mean, Ed looked too, and we couldn't find anything in writing, and I guess it's a little bit of a lesson learned. If we're going to make an agreement that we're going to give any department X amount of dollars, it needs to be very specific in minutes, in a motion, or, you know, just so that you can go back and find it. And we could not. It was just basically an agreement. He also said that he's been very proactive and very concerned about maintenance, because I said, if you're not going to use it, there's $200,000 odd dollars that went into his budget. And he said, we've committed to $200,000 a year for 3 years for things like carpet, and there will always be something more after that that they couldn't fit into their budget. And I said, I would feel better if you would commit that money would be, that you would always have some sort of a dedication to maintenance. And while it's not in writing, I feel somewhat better, although I wish we had the other agreement in writing, lesson learned. So that's kind of the end of what I've been talking about for the last few meetings.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Bob, you had your hand up as well.
I'm disappointed with this budget, mostly because of the process. I think this committee's executed a decent process, but I think other boards and committees have not applied the level of rigor and review that they should to these proposed spending programs. I will not be voting to recommend Article 2 this budget for the reasons I just articulated, and for the reasons that, as I was asking questions throughout this process, I understood the answers I was given, but I didn't find them particularly satisfying. I am troubled by the growth in these budgets and the spend. I am troubled by the capital budget and how monies are being allocated. To echo some of Nancy's comments, I'm troubled by how the schools are spending capital dollars and operational dollars. I think all of this is exceedingly rich and unrealistic in the current economic environment, and it is a significant ask of taxpayers that I am certainly hopeful that my opposing the recommendation of the budget will encourage others, both here and at town meeting, to vote no.
Thank you, Bob. Nancy?
Bob, can I just ask, what would you have done differently?
Well, Across the board, Nancy, I think that both the departments that are presenting to the boards and the boards themselves have repeatedly failed to ask for alternatives. What are our choices? What are the alternatives that we might consider? How could we reduce expense and cost? Those discussions simply don't take place, and I'm troubled by that. That's a broad theme. More specifically, I've seen trends continue year after year that I find quite troubling. How we prioritize or fail to prioritize maintenance throughout the town-owned assets and real estate is troubling to me. I've articulated that for years here. I also articulated that I'm troubled by the fact that the school administration is characterizing what I would call basic operational maintenance, like painting rooms, as capital expenses. I just don't think that's so, and I've called them on it a number of times. So I think I'm to a point, Nancy, where along with engaging and asking questions and encouraging different thinking, I'm simply prepared to draw a line and say no.
Any further discussion regarding the motion to recommend the fiscal 26 budget?
Ed.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and so I agree, Bob, with some of your sentiments on classification of maintenance as capital items. But what concerns me about drawing a line in the sand now is I feel this budget does start to address some of the things we've talked about for quite some time in regards to maintenance. And, you know, in regards to adding the $500,000 to the DPW budget, that is a direct reflection, I think, of us trying to focus on maintenance. And it's hard to maintain the number of miles of roads we have, the number of buildings we have, the acres of lands we have without spending money. And so I think it gets a little challenging when it feels like sometimes they're speaking out of both sides of our mouths that we want more and better maintenance, but we don't want to support the economic aspect of that, which obviously it's a financial burden, understood. But I think in order to keep maintenance and repair moving forward, we need to support this. So for that reason, I am supporting this budget.
And I share Bob's sentiments as well regarding maintenance, because likewise I have made comments about that for several years, having been a member of the committee. As I looked at the budget, though, I was encouraged by the addition of the $60,000 in the maintenance budget, which is just a piece of it. The schools didn't address it, but certainly there's a movement as well, as Matt points out, to the DPW budget. It gets, there's some momentum there, is how I look at it. Go ahead.
I don't think there's a need to create significant debate tonight, and I'm sure we simply have different opinions. But I'll say again, I would have much preferred to hear the other boards and committees and the department heads themselves engaging in conversations around choices. When taxpayers are at home thinking of their budgets and thinking of maintenance and thinking of capital improvements and other activities, quite often they sit down and begin to make choices. We were going to do this, but maybe we won't. We'll do this instead. We'll prioritize, and we'll live within our means. And what I've consistently heard here is not we'll live within our means, it's, well, if you give us some more money, we'll do more things. And I understand that logic, and it's certainly a logical approach to budgeting and finance, but where resources are limited and where people's ability to pay is limited, at some point, I think it's fair to suggest that we have to make choices, hard choices, difficult choices, but choices nonetheless. And if we'd even started with understanding in our conversations what the possible choices might be, I would be satisfied. But that hasn't happened. It doesn't routinely happen. And so I think tonight we're going to have different ways of expressing ourselves with our votes.
Very good. Any further discussion? All right, hearing no further discussion, let's move to vote. And reminder, we'll be doing a roll call vote. So, Crystal?
I approve.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin? Andrew?
No.
James?
Yes.
Bob?
No.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, so 2 noes and 6 yeses. Is that right?
Yes.
Very good. Bud, take us through the next one, enterprise funds.
The next article is Article 3. It's at the top of page 8 in the draft warrant, and it lists the recommended amount for the 4 enterprise funds. And I think as we've gone over, there's nothing substantively different year to year on any of these 4 operating budgets.
Okay. Motion to recommend the fiscal 26 enterprise fund operating budgets.
I motion.
Crystal, motion. Nancy, second. Any discussion? Jim?
My only discussion would be on the previous vote. I don't know if we did that in a motion form. Did somebody move and there was a seconded?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Just want to make sure.
Crystal moved, Nancy second on the first, and then we moved to discussion.
Okay.
Then we moved to a vote.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Any discussion on enterprise fund budgets? Motions have been made, no discussion. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, it's unanimous. Next item is the fiscal 26 revolving fund appropriation limits.
So just to remind everyone, we have to vote this every year under state law, and it's all of the formal revolving funds that have been set up through the years. And what we need to do is to approve an outlying high expenditure limit as a revolving fund. Funds that come in for these programs can then be spent to run those programs, and we can't exceed what we bring in. The only new one that we've added over the last year is the short-term rental inspections. Everything else is similar to last year, and in fact, the expenditure amounts are the same as last year.
Thank you, Bud. Motion to recommend fiscal 26 revolving fund appropriation limits.
I motion.
Crystal? Jim, second. Thank you. Any discussion on this item? Seeing no discussion, Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, unanimous on that item. The next one is the capital budget for 1.5 plus million dollars. Bud, want to just review that?
Yeah, so as Ed just mentioned, the wording of the article starts on page 9, and then on page 10, there's a chart showing the department, the item, and or service, and the amount on the right. So the grand total is just over 1.5 million, with 2 offsets that total just over 400,000. One from the Golf Enterprise Fund, the other from the Arena Enterprise Fund. So the net request is 1.143 million. Other than the transfers, the remaining balance gets paid for from the town's certified free cash.
Okay, thank you. Motion to recommend the capital budget.
Motion?
Crystal, Kevin seconds it. Any discussion on the capital budget? Bob?
I'll be voting no on this request as well. And I touched a little earlier on my thoughts around maintenance. But besides that, my recollection of our conversation about the capital budget was that there were items within the capital budget where that money was being put aside for future use. This is a relatively small number in terms of the overall budget. We have pressing capital needs, including all of us have heard repeatedly about roads and other pressing capital needs. And I find it troubling that with such a small allocation being set aside for capital, that within the capital budget, we're specifically setting aside monies not to spend. And so I find this problematic, and I'll be voting no.
Thank you, Bob. Nancy?
Bud, can you clarify, year over year, is all the money always spent? And if it's not spent, what happens to it?
Yeah, so on the capital appropriations, those carry over year to year until they're fully expended. I'm just making it up. Say 40,000 was approved for a vehicle purchase and it came in at 37.5. If a year later there's 2,500 in the account, the town accountant checks with that department and then they zero out and that gets returned at the end.
Return to free cash?
Yeah, eventually.
Or-
I mean, it gets returned at the balance at the end of the year, which ultimately gets certified as free cash several months after that.
It doesn't go back to the.
No, it doesn't go back to capital. Yeah,
So if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah,
for the
except,
intended purpose.
a lot of these some of these are multi-year things, so they get carried over for that.
Okay, okay.
So typically before anything gets zeroed out, even with the schools, the accounting office will double check with them to see where things sit. But separate accounts are set up for each item on the list.
And I have expressed a couple weeks ago when we looked at capital, similar concerns that Bob just addressed regarding, in particular, the what I kind of refer to as some reserve funds that are being set up for future potential needs that don't meet even the numbers that we're looking for under the historical buildings repair, as well as the emergency account funding. And I made the comparison of looking to fund those with a fund, but then seeing in the long-range capital plan, well over, I think, $1 million in needs at Oak Crest, and we're not doing anything about that at this point, but are going to put money aside for future stuff. So that's among one of the reasons that I too will be voting no on the capital budget. Any other discussion on capital? Okay, no further discussion there. Let's move to a vote to recommend. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
No.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a no. It is 6 yeses and 2 noes. Thank you for that. And next item is the Chapter 90 State Aid to Highway Program.
Yeah, so Article 6 is a little bit unique. The state wants us to vote this each year, even though they don't have a number to give us on what they're going to provide us. So they just asked for this generic vote without a number specified. But obviously, any money they give us for public roads, we take. So,
Could I have a motion on Chapter 90 State Aid to the Highways Programs?
So moved.
Jim moves on that. Kevin seconds. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, we'll move to vote. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Matt,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. It's unanimous. Article 7 deals with the school department cellular lease transfer and the appropriation of those funds.
Yeah, so this is at the bottom of page 10, and the amount that's been raised or received since the last vote at town meeting was $34,618, and that those funds are restricted to be used on maintenance and improvement of exterior athletic fields and facilities at the high school.
Very good. Motion to recommend school department cellular lease transfer and appropriation of funds. Nancy,
I move, so move.
any second? Kevin, second. Any discussion? Bob?
I'll be voting no, and the reason I'll be voting no is I have a recollection that this particular revenue stream was discussed at the same time or in close proximity to asking taxpayers to fund the construction of the new football field and track. And an impression was created, perhaps even something more specific than an impression, that these funds were going to be used to maintain that track and field. This board knows that that's not how the monies have been spent, and this board knows that a request was made for capital monies to specifically address maintenance and repair of the field and the track. I find that troubling, and so for that reason, even though the dollars involved here are relatively small, I'll be voting no as a matter of sending a message.
Thank you, Bob. Any other discussion? Nancy?
But do you remember, to answer Bob's question, was it that the overall request was more than what this was going to be, is why it was separated?
I think there was a movement on the part of the school, because this was set up at a special vote at town meeting that required the adoption of special legislation by the state, which they did. So it set up the account, and that's why it restricts it for that one purpose. I don't remember the exact tie-in. The timing, I think Bob's correct, the timing is really close of when that all happened. I'd have to look it up to see exactly, but I think one of the thoughts was there were concerns about the maintenance on the athletic fields outside at the high school, and that this was a revenue source that could be, focused on that.
And wasn't this is for all the fields, not just the track and football?
Right, it's,
So
yeah.
it really doesn't go very far
No, it doesn't.
this year.
Nope, nope.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none on this one, let's move to a vote regarding the school department cellular lease transfer and appropriation of funds. Crystal?
No.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
No?
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, 6-2. 6 yes, 2 no's. Thank you. The next item is Article 8, which is the beach renourishment account appropriation for about $80,000.
Yeah, so this is another example of a petition article that was submitted at town meeting. It was approved. It called for 20% of all beach parking funds from all beaches, including freshwater, to be set aside, and that those funds could only be used for future ocean, beach, and dune renourishment projects. So we set that aside every year. We've used it for any number of things that related to what's addressed for. It works. Don't quite understand why we take money from freshwater ponds to spend on the ocean, but that's what the vote was, so that's what we do.
Okay. Motion to recommend the beach renourishment account appropriation.
A motion.
Crystal moves. Nancy seconds. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, we'll move to vote for the beach renourishment account appropriation. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I am a yes. That's unanimous. Article 9 addresses the Sandwich Promotions Fund appropriations.
Yes, we're on a roll with old petition articles that led to funding requirements. So this again was a petition article back in, boy, I bet you this one goes back 15 at least years, but then it was recently updated in 2020. And what it does, it requires a certain percentage of our rooms tax fund to be set aside for different purposes. Once all the, and it's money that we received the prior fiscal year, so it's money that we have in our accounts, so these numbers are known, not speculative. So grand total, the amount that's getting appropriated to the 3 required accounts totals just over $150,000. And in round numbers, it's $60,000 to the Visitor Services Board and the Sandwich Chamber of Commerce, and $30,000 to the Canal Region Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, thank you, Bud. Motion to recommend Sandwich Promotions Fund appropriations.
I so move.
Nancy moves. Second by Jim. Any discussion on this? I just have my comment on this is one that again, it's not a big amount of money, but it's one that I've asked about, I think, each year since I've joined the committee, particularly in regards to the Canal Region Chamber, that other towns don't participate in the funding of that, which I find they get to take advantage of it, but they don't participate the way that we so kindly do, even if it's $30,000. And being a frequent enough rider of the Plymouth and Brockton bus, and the office being closed most of the year, kind of just drives me crazy knowing that we're spending some money on that. So that being said,
I do have another comment on that slight question, and I know that this is the amount. Is there any way that that can be changed in years coming?
Yeah,
Let's say we move it to 15, and then, the other 15 gets split up between the visitor center and the chamber.
Yeah, we'd have to take a look at, you see how it refers to Chapter 313 of the Acts of 2020? We'd have to look at that, make an amendment at town meeting, and then it gets filed with the legislature. It used to take about a year to get those through, and lately it seems like across the state it's taking a lot longer. So it probably wouldn't take effect until the it would not take effect until the state legislature approved it. So even if we approved a change now, it would probably be 2-3 years by the time you saw it. But
Yeah,
you can do it that
not
way.
saying now,
Yeah.
necessarily,
Yeah.
but, in, a year or so, because as inflation, and we've all seen it, things keep raising.
Mm-hmm.
What is this gonna, like, when it gets approved in 4 years, what is it gonna be then?
I know when this was first adopted, the Sandwich Chamber, like in their wildest dreams, was hoping it would get to 25,000. So it's pretty amazing how much, costs for lodging have gone up, but also you figure all the short-term rentals that even 5 years ago probably didn't exist, that now they're quite popular. So it's sort of interesting that that's one small segment of, I guess, the economy everywhere that's a lot different than it was.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
any further discussion on this article? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to a vote for the Sandwich Promotions Fund appropriations. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a no. It's 7-1. 7 yes, 1 no. Moving on to Article 10 is the appropriation of the WIF balance for wastewater purposes. Bud?
Yeah, so this is just appropriating money that's already been received and has been set aside so it can be used to further implement our improvements. I think based on that larger update we had 3-4 weeks ago, probably the biggest thing we actively have taking part is our different improvements at the school departments. So that is still progressing, which is good.
Very good. All right, motion to move the appropriation, motion to recommend the appropriation of the WIF balance for wastewater purposes.
So moved.
Jim moves,
Second.
second by Nancy. Discussion. Seeing no discussion, let's move to a vote on the appropriation of the WIF balance for wastewater purposes. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, unanimous. Moving on to Article 11, which is the opioid settlement appropriation for outreach services. Bud?
So this is to appropriate $50,000 in money we've already received from the National Opioid Settlement Funds. Those are scheduled to come in over the next, I think it's 21 years. The primary thing that a group who's been focusing on that has decided to use that for, with town meeting support, is the social worker position in the police department. And then this is another initiative which, if there's any questions, I'll have Heather provide better update than I could.
Motion on the opioid settlement appropriation for outreach services.
Actually, so moved.
So moved by Jim,
A second.
second by Crystal. Discussion. Jim?
Is this a one-time thing, or does this payment come in every year?
The payments come in over the course of the year, and they continue to come in every year. This request is part of a recommendation 2 years ago. Town meeting appropriated $120,000 for opioid abatement programming. We've had a very active working group working on recommendations on how to expend those funds. One area is to have active programming at the Center for Active Living or other community buildings for different folks in different stages of either addiction, family members, prevention programming. We'd like to be able to enter into a multi-year agreement if we're satisfied with that. So we're recommending an additional $50,000 for that particular outreach program so that we can engage in a multi-year contract if we're satisfied with programming.
Bob?
How, I think you mentioned this was federal opioid monies. My understanding is there's also state opioid monies. How much opioid-related money do we currently have, I'm going to call it on hand, please?
Yeah, Bill, I don't know if you know that. I want to say, go ahead.
So, Bob, it's not federal or state opioid money. This is part of a national lawsuit that the town was a plaintiff in, and the town, as part of that settlement in that national lawsuit, is receiving funds each and every year. We have roughly, I don't have the number in front of me, but I'd say we have roughly $250,000 on hand currently. We do get those funds probably 3-4 times a year from the National Clearinghouse that's been set up to handle that lawsuit and the payments thereof. So these funds that $50,000 that we're talking about here would be coming from those settlement funds directly.
Okay, so for a future agenda item, could we please get a presentation on how much we have, how often it shows up, sources of revenue, and how it's being spent, please? And then, Bud, can I just confirm that to the extent that settlement funds have been used to fund positions, employment positions, that those same funds are not being applied or set aside or used to fund retirement liabilities? Is that correct?
No, you're right. It's just the base salary that we've used those funds for. The phrase that you see in that warrant article on the top of page 12, when it says for the purpose of, those phrases over those next three lines are what town meeting voted for a couple years ago. So it restricts us on what we can use those for, and I know those settlement agreements are quite strict. I'm not saying you couldn't use it for retirement stuff, but you can't use it for non-opioid or public health outreach purposes.
Bob, I've made a note to have that for an agenda item. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing no further discussion, let's move to a vote on the opioid settlement appropriation for outreach services. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes, that's unanimous. Move on to Article 12, which is the Community Preservation Committee's Act fund expenditure, administrative cost, 10% allocations, and a debt payment. This is funding of over $1 million. Go ahead, Bud.
Yes, so this article is the one we vote every single year. It includes the $75,000 in administrative funds that get used for various purposes by the committee throughout the year. Anything that's left in that gets returned to the fund. And then we're required, if you recall, 10% of the annual amount we bring in through CPA funds has to go each to historic resources, open space, and affordable housing purposes, those three. And then the other 70% goes to the overall account. And then that's also where we pay any CPA debt that we have. So the grand total of all those three or four things that I mentioned is just over $1.17 million.
Okay. Motion to recommend CPA fund expenditure, administrative costs, 10% allocations, and the debt payment.
I move.
Crystal moves. Any second? Nancy seconds. Any discussion on this item? But can you give us an example of how that, what the administrative expenses are?
So occasionally, like, these are some of the things we've used it for in the past. So say there's a prime piece of open space that the committee might be aware of and become interested in. That's where they would pay to get the appraisal to do an estimate of value, because it's a requirement before town meeting votes to accept anything, you have to have an estimate on that. In the past, there's been some small requests that have been made for professional services related for the town putting together an application in the future, and that's come from that. We used to pay the person that staffed that committee partially out of those funds, and now it's a requirement of a position in town to do that. So it doesn't come from there. I bet you every year we probably return half of it, and it just goes back into the fund.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, move to vote to recommend CPA fund expenditures, administrative costs, 10% allocations, and debt payment. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
No.
And Matt?
Yes.
And I am a yes. That is 7 yeses, 1 no.
Hey, can I add one thing? I think on that 75,000, my recollection, it doesn't happen much. If the cost for whatever service we need is under 5,000, I can approve it. If it's over 5,000, the committee votes for it.
Okay. Thanks for that.
Yep.
Next article is Article 13, which is a CPA, Community Preservation Act project for the town hall restoration at $1.2 million.
Yes, so in my opinion, this follows along the line of some of the things that the committee has talked about previously about trying to get other sources to pay for maintenance activities. So this is to renovate this building. Key to that renovation are the full window replacements, except for the one out front on the second floor, to prevent water infiltration, to improve the treatment of the ceiling shingles, and then to try to improve the surrounding exterior, again, to make it as weather tight as possible. Just to refresh everyone's memory, at last May, we approved $1,042,000 in appropriations from a couple different sources to go towards this work. Heather got a grant for $200,000 from the state, and if this gets approved at $1.2 million, the grand total that we would have is about $2.4 million. About the only money we've spent since then is we did hire, after going out to bid, the preservation architect and the project manager, and have been working on, trying to put together the cost estimate that led to this $1.2 million, and importantly, did already get approval from the Historic District Committee.
Very good. Motion needed for CPA project town hall restoration.
I move.
Crystal moves. Nancy seconds. Any discussion?
Yeah, this is the one that I kind of have concerns with. We talked about having to make choices and tough decisions. I just don't see how we can continue to support 2 town halls. I know when I moved to town in 2008, we had this town hall. Soon after that, there was a town vote to refurbish it. And then not soon after that, there was an interesting vote to build a new town hall. So I'm not so sure. Did we have discussions at that time, what was going to happen to this building? I mean, was this going to be phased out eventually? Were we going to continue to repair this building and do repairs at the new town hall? I mean, at some point, I think decisions have to be made. I know people would much rather see these funds go towards maybe our fields, open spaces, something like that. So I don't know if other members feel the same way, but I don't see how we can support 2 town halls. I don't. So I think this is one that I know I'll be a no vote on.
Jim, any other discussion? Nancy?
Does this conclude the work that needs to be done, at least in the near future, on this building?
Yeah, this is everything that we can foresee at this point.
And I guess my feeling, it is a little frustrating to have, like Jim says, 2 town halls, but they serve different purposes. There's no way we could have meetings like this anywhere else. And we are having an occupant downstairs that is pretty much what we had hoped for.
Jim?
And I would just say, as to whether or not we can meet, I mean, we can always meet at Sand Hill. The thing down the Cal is always a place we can meet. I don't think the crowd, I've been on school committee, planning board, now finance committee. I've never seen an overload of a crowd. So I think, that use. And yeah, as for a tenant downstairs, 16 hours a week, I don't know if that's really what we had envisioned as well. So I do think we need to have serious concerns as to what is the future of this building.
How long is the lease for the folks downstairs? And it's minimal rent as well, or lease payment, it's like $1,000 a month.
I'd have to look. It covers the cost of them being there. It doesn't generate excess revenue for the town. And I think it's 3 years. It's not a long-term lease.
Any further discussion on this item? Bob, no. You were reaching there, so. Very good. All right, let's move to a vote on CPA project town hall restoration. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
No.
Bob?
No.
Matt?
Yes.
And I'm a yes. So 6 yeses, 2 nos on the CPA project. The next 2 items, Article 14 and Article 15, but we should take them in order. The first one is the HERO Act Disabled Veterans Exemption Adjustment.
Yeah, so, and I'd encourage Bill when I'm done, if he wants to add anything, to do so. So there, recent law that the state adopted last calendar year called the HERO Act, and it relates to disabled veterans. There's a couple of different provisions that apply if, and I stress if, towns wanted to entertain them. So after looking at things, and I know the select board has had a couple of individuals come into meetings through the years just to talk about that. The Board of Assessors, who is most responsible or fully responsible for administering our exemptions. So the first article, Article 14, it seeks to adopt a provision of that HERO Act that would adjust any of the exemptions that are allowed under state law for disabled vets to be adjusted annually by the Consumer Price Index, and the law specifies like how that will be determined and what official at the state level will determine that percentage and notify the towns year to year. So recently, our Director of Assessing, Ben Steich, has been meeting with the Board of Assessors to talk things over. The assessors have recommended that we go ahead with that percentage increase each year based on the CPI. So that is supported by the Board of Assessors, and I know the Select Board was supportive of putting this article on. We're going to give them a similar update in more detail than what I just said on Thursday night.
And if I can just add, Ed, I know the question was asked last week about kind of the monetary value of what the passage of this article would mean. And Ben Steich, our assessor, he did some calculations. I went over it with him, and this article here would be roughly $8,500. But again, as I mentioned last week, these numbers would be fluid, but roughly it would be $85 currently.
Bill, my hearing, I'm sure. So $8,500 is the total impact of this?
Correct. This roughly, yes.
Yep. Thank you. All right. So we have a motion on the recommendation for HERO Act Disabled Veterans Exemption Amount, adjustment rather. Nancy moves.
I move.
Kevin seconds. Any discussion on this item? Seeing no discussion, move to a vote for the HERO Act, recommendation on the HERO Act Disabled Veterans Exemption Adjustment. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
I'm a yes. That's unanimous on that. Article 15 follows along the HERO Act regarding a disabled veterans exemption.
Yeah, so this one's a little bit more meaty, and if you look in that additional packet that had the backup material, there's a spreadsheet landscaped. It might be good to look at that. It's about halfway back in that packet. So similar to what Bill was relaying, I'll let you know. So the fiscal year we just concluded, the grand total of all the exemptions that were given for disabled vets totaled about $170,000. So with the CPI adjustment that Bill had mentioned, about $8,500, the total amount after that, if that was approved, would jump to about just under $180,000. So what the act said is that towns, if they decided to adopt it, and they didn't have to, if they did, they could decide any percentage between 25% and 100% that would be given in addition to the existing exemption. So long story short, after studying this, the Board of Assessors, and this is going to be presented to the Select Board Thursday night, has recommended an additional exemption of 25% for any disabled vet who qualifies for this program, which is anticipated to cost us, if the enrollment was the exact same year to year, about $45,000. We felt the other percentages were too high and would be too much. These funds come from the overlay account, which when you look at your one-page budget summary is on the upper right of the expenses, and we appropriate $500,000 a year for abatements, exemptions, all that comes from that overlay account. And so 25% is what is being recommended. My understanding is there's several towns on the Cape that aren't presenting anything. We thought it was worthy. I think, as I had explained to the Select Board last week, the state is excellent about any base amount, that 180,000 that I mentioned, they're really good about reimbursing you 100% for what your costs were the following year. Any town that adopts an additional amount above the base amount, they will not be receiving state reimbursement for that. So in a way, that 25% exposure based on the enrollments today is about $45,000. And I should stress it's very strict on the documentation you provide to prove that you're at least 10% disabled. It's not income-based. It's just based on veterans' disability. There are other exemptions that exist, income-based if needed.
Okay, thank you, Bud.
Motion to recommend Article 15.
Bob makes a motion to recommend Article 15, second by Kevin. Any discussion on this? Okay, seeing no discussion, we'll move to a vote for a recommendation on the HERO Act Disabled Veterans Exemption. Crystal?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Kevin?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes.
Bob?
Yes.
Matt?
Yes.
I'm a yes, it's unanimous. Thank you all for votes on Articles 1 through 15, which are the financially related.
One more.
Is there one more? Okay.
One more if you,
Right,
if
sorry.
you bear with us, and that's
16,
Article
sorry.
16.
All right.
So, and Bill, I'll need your help on this one too as well. There was a Supreme Court decision related to tax title process and how that works, which eventually led to the state adopting new laws related to people who are more than 1 year past due in taxes and the procedures towns go through. One of the things that came to light is that there's a provision of the general laws that say any abandoned funds that are in the custody of the town, if we adopt this provision, it stays in the custody of the town. If not, they get turned over to the state. So town council has recommended to all their clients, if you haven't adopted Chapter 200A, Section 9A, that we should. The opinion letter from town council is in the supporting packet that we provided. That's about all I know about it.
Bill, did you want to add any prelude?
Just kind of as I mentioned last week, that this is directly involves the tax title changes that the state pushed through last July. And so this is kind of a direct response to that. Essentially, the tax title laws were changed almost from almost completely, I guess, to be, the way we post and the way we collect money. So this has to do with the collection of funds. By adopting this, the town would be able to hold on to those excess unclaimed funds as opposed to turning those over to the state treasurer. And as Bud mentioned, again, this is at the advice of town council.
Thanks, Bill. Move to make motions to recommend
I move.
accept the provisions of Mass General Law, Chapter 200A, Section 9A. Crystal moves. Nancy seconds. Any discussion? Seeing none, let's move to a vote on Article 16. Crystal,
Yes.
Nancy,
Yes.
Kevin,
Yes.
Andrew,
Yes.
Jim,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Matt,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. Article 16, unanimous recommendation. Okay, now we've completed 16, thank you all, of the fiscal-related articles that will be in the town meeting warrant. But if you wanted to cover any of these to give some visibility.
Sure.
So,
So the remaining articles, the next two were two zoning amendments. It's sort of interesting. We've said it a couple times already tonight. Some of the articles in reaction to new laws that have been adopted by the state. So as part of the state housing initiative, they've pushed further, like opening up of the ability for people to do accessory dwelling units. And that's all defined in our zoning. Some people used to call them in-law apartments. In the past, some of them would be restricted to being, if it's not an immediate family member, to being used for income restricted people. So the state has tried to expand all that. And so This is a reaction to adopt the proper regulations in place to allow homeowners to take advantage of that. So the planning board has worked for quite a while to come up with this language. It's printed in the warrant if you're interested under Article 18. And they held their public hearing, I think, last week and, voted to approve the language that's in the warrant. And then similarly, Article 19, this goes back to some zoning that was adopted in the early to mid 1990s. Non-conforming lots were if you owned a house lot and then you had another lot next to it that you decided not to subdivide or build, it forced the contiguous lots to be combined. So I believe what this does, and then restrict on how much additional you could build on that. What this does is it tries to support the accessory dwelling unit concept. So you couldn't build a full-size house, but if you built a smaller size to help with the housing crisis, that would be allowed. So I'm not a zoning expert, but again, the zoning bylaw changes as the planning board advertised them and held their public hearing, and as voted, are printed in the warrant under Article 19. And then sort of on a roll on Article 20, again, is a reaction to state law change related to short-term rentals. I think the safest way to say it is there were instances of Massachusetts citizens in short-term rentals in other parts of the country where things like a fire would happen, smoke detectors weren't there, people were killed, and so it started to get more and more of a concern. And it's not trying to stick it to people, but it's just that if you're going to do a short-term rental, it should be registered with the town and registered with the state. That's always been a requirement, the state part. So it now requires people to register with the town, and then also to do an annual inspection. It's not an inspection for everything. It's for things like, smoke detectors, proper natural gas hookups, things like that. So there's the proposed bylaw that's printed in the warrant. That would be the general bylaw, not a zoning bylaw. And the select board actually have a public hearing on that Thursday night. And Leanne Drake, our Director of Community Development, is going to explain the language that she's worked on with town council and with our building commissioner's office. I don't think there's anything really draconian in what's been proposed, and the proposed fees are pretty reasonable to register annually, and the inspection fee is fairly minor. If they have to go back for a second inspection, there's another charge that's assessed. That's about it.
All right, thank you. Any questions on any of those other articles that we don't need to make a recommendation on, but? Okay. Seeing any, we are at the time for old business. Anyone have any old business? Seeing none there, how about any new business? Seeing none there. Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
Just a quickie for Bud. On page 1, about halfway through the packet of the warrant, you've got Jim's name correctly. But on the second page of the handout, which looks exactly the same, you don't.
Yep, that was from earlier in the week, so I caught that. Sorry.
Just wanted to make sure we had him.
Thank you, Kevin.
I spelled Gary Blank's name wrong once one year. He's very upset.
Very good. All right. We're at the time for public comments. Does anyone with us this evening have a public comment to wrap up our meeting? Seeing no public comments, we will move to closing remarks. And I just want, Nancy, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that even though it seems like we kind of rushed through these, we've been talking about these for 2 months in a lot of detail, and this was our opportunity to maybe do reminders or clarify some points or just add things that we thought of after the fact. So if anybody was concerned that we weren't putting the time in, we definitely have.
Thank you, Nancy. I was going to start off my remarks in a similar way to thank each of our Finance Committee members for your participation and engagement over the last number of weeks as we set forth in reviewing the fiscal 26 budget and other financial matters that will come before residents at the May 5th annual town meeting. So thank you all very much for the work that you've put into this. For the hard work of our town administrators, led by Bud and Heather and Bill, along with your staffs. I know I speak for the committee in thanking them for their efforts in pulling together the information that helped us make our recommendations. To those from the public that came before us during the budget season, thanks for sharing your thoughts. Your willingness to speak up has not gone unnoticed and should be an example of democracy in action. The Finance Committee meeting does not have any further meetings scheduled in advance of town meeting, but if they're necessary, Bill and or Bud will reach out to us. We do typically meet in late June for some other necessary financial matters. Anybody else have any closing remarks? Nancy?
Thank you for your leadership in getting us through all of this.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Appreciate that.
Second that. Thank you for everything in your first year as chair.
Thank you.
A lot of work.
Appreciate it. Anything else? Seeing nothing further, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Crystal motions, Nancy
Yep.
seconds, and we'll go down the row. Crystal,
Yes.
Nancy,
Yes.
Kevin,
Yes.
Andrew, Jim,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Matt,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. It's unanimous. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Have a
Thank
good
you,
week.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.